There we go. Sorry for the confusion, guys. Welcome everyone. Um, David, I'm just going to hand over the proceedings to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. My name is David Grosky, and welcome everyone to this year's legal panel course that we've had for several years now. And I'm once again very pleased and very honored to be moderating for the 4-session course. Tonight, we're thrilled once again, as we've had for the last 3 years, to have Alan Mills as our initial guest speaker. I'll be introducing Alan in a moment. I usually begin, as I will this evening, with the Devar Torah. And as I've done every year, I want to begin with my Devar Torah, focusing on gratitude. Grateful for really just living another day. A person, in my case, who was in prison for over 10 years, went through a very difficult medical diagnosis when I was in prison, wasn't given long to live, got a reprieve. And even though I went through very difficult years going through that prison time, when I look back, I say to myself how fortunate and how Hashem was watching over me to give me another chance at life through getting through the illness. And so there isn't a day that goes by that I'm not grateful for living, grateful for being reunited with my children, my 2 daughters, who both live in the Chicago area as I do, and just being grateful really to have an opportunity to share with you this evening and being part of this course and being part of the Hinda Institute family. So with that, I would like to introduce our initial guest speaker, Alan Mills. Alan Mills is the executive director of the Uptown People's Law Center, where he represents prisoners throughout the Illinois state prison system. Alan began working at UPLC in 1979 as a law student volunteer, and he's worked there in one capacity or another ever since that time. He made his first visit to an Illinois prison in 1982, and he's been visiting prisoners ever since. UPLC currently has 4 class action cases against the Illinois Department of Corrections, including cases about medical care, mental health care, and the excessive use of solitary. Recently concluded challenging the way that the Department of Corrections and the Prisoner Review Board handled parole revocations. I'm very pleased and honored to once again, as I have for the last 3 years, to introduce you all to Alan Mills. Alan, welcome.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, and it's always a pleasure to talk to this great group of people that you pull together every couple of years for me, or I guess every year for me. So as David said, I've been doing this work at the Uptown People's Law Center. I started there as a second-year law student intern back in 1979, and sort of knocked on the door and said, "Do you guys need any help?" And they said yes, and I'm still here 40 some years later. So I guess they really did want some help from me. During that time, the Uptown People's Law Center is a neighborhood-based legal aid center, and it does, over the years, it's done all kinds of different work. Currently, we do 3 different kinds of law. We represent tenants who are facing illegal evictions. We represent people who have disabilities, who have been wrongfully denied Social Security disability benefits. And then we represent prisoners throughout the state of Illinois and occasionally in federal in federal prisons, relating to what happens inside that prison. So we don't know anything about innocence. I don't get people out of prison on innocence, and I don't know anything about defending them in their criminal cases. But if you're in prison and something goes wrong there, then that's what we do. 90% of our litigation has been against the Illinois Department of Corrections, and almost all of that has been in federal court, including all 3 districts in Illinois, the Northern, Central, and Southern District. Uptown People's Law Center is located on the north side of Chicago. Anybody who's a Cubs fan, we're located exactly a mile north of Wrigley Field. If you walk out the bleacher entrance and head north, then you hit our office exactly a mile later. It's an odd sort of combination that we do. So people are often wondering, how in the world does a neighborhood-based legal clinic actually represent prisoners? And it's because the people who founded the Uptown People's Law Center, which was before I got there in the mid-70s, very much believed that when you went to prison from the neighborhood, your parents may live in the neighborhood, your mom and dad may still live there, your kids may live there, your brother and sister may live there, and therefore you're still part of the community. Just because you're temporarily housed in prison or even long-term housed in prison, you are still a member of our community, and therefore our mission of helping people in the community with their legal problems extends to the legal problems you may have when you're in prison. So the first prison cases we did were people from the uptown area who ended up in prison. But then it expanded. As I'm sure anybody who's been in prison knows, or anybody who's worked with prisoners knows, once you do one prisoner case, word sort of spreads and you get lots of letters and lots of requests. And of course, there's so many different problems in prison. And then from our unique perspective, we started off, we did a couple of individual cases, but then the main case I've worked on over the years was by a man who was in solitary at the old Joliet prison, built in the Civil War, was put back into a solitary unit and filed a handwritten complaint listing hundreds of different problems in the prison. He was not well educated. He did it with another prisoner who was even less educated, had only a third grade education. The judge took one look at it and threw out about 90% of the case, but did hold in there one little piece of it, which said, we don't really know what we're doing. We tried to get to court into the law library so we get some help, and they wouldn't let us go because we're in solitary. So the judge said, well, that can't be right. So he held that up. So then this guy from Uptown writes us and says, well, I don't know much about the law, but the one thing I know is when the state's going to ask you questions under oath, you should have a lawyer with you. And I got this notice saying they're going to come down and depose me. And that sounds a lot like a questioning under oath. So can somebody come down and be my lawyer for this deposition thing? So we did. And then we took this, what started off as a handwritten, simple complaint and expanded into a statewide class action case, arguing that people who were in solitary throughout the state of Illinois didn't have meaningful access to the courts because they weren't allowed to go to the library. They couldn't get any help. And as you can imagine, doing legal work from a cell is pretty difficult. That case went on for 18 years. We won 3 different rulings from 3 different judges that the existing system was unconstitutional. And then the wonderful Supreme Court changed the rules of standing. And ultimately, the Seventh Circuit, our appellate court here in Chicago, ruled that neither of our 2 named plaintiffs had ever tried hard enough to get to the law library in the first place, therefore did not have standing to bring the case in the first place and throughout the entire case after 18 years of litigation. The good news is, from all that, I fell in love with prison litigation and said, there are so many obvious problems in here. I have to try to do something about this. And this is what I and other people say is the more you learn about prisons, the less you can live with yourself without trying to do something about them, because they are just horrible places. The other, it turns out, advantage is doing an access to the courts case is a great way to advertise in prison because you meet all of the jailhouse lawyers who are trying to file in court. So you meet hundreds of people. And from that case, we had lots and lots of people used as witnesses. And then with word spread, we started to get letters. We currently get between 75 and 100 letters per week from prisoners throughout the state. And now every time we get coverage in the newspapers or in any national publication, we get them from all over the country for a while. As David said, we currently have 4 class action cases because obviously we couldn't possibly, as a small office, when I started there were 4 of us. We're now up to 16, half lawyers and half everybody else, paralegals, development people, et cetera. We couldn't possibly represent everybody who has a legal problem. So we started to sort of package these things, and that's how we got into the class action business. And we have a class action about medical care. We have one about solitary, which is sort of the outgrowth of our original case. We just finished one up about the failure to accommodate deaf and hard of hearing prisoners. Illinois wasn't providing either ASL or hearing aids to people. Now they are, as a result of our litigation. And we have one about excessive use of force, where a bunch of tactical officers beat up prisoners throughout 4 different prisons, about 10,000 prisoners total in the Southern Illinois. We also do a little bit of parole work. I'm actually talking to you today not from our office, but from a hotel in Springfield, because tomorrow morning I'm actually appearing before the Illinois Prison Review Board on behalf of 2 longtime prisoners that I've known, both of whom are up for parole tomorrow. So hopefully we'll get 2 people out tomorrow if all goes well. Ironically, one of them I met when we did a case about Tamp's Supermax prison, and he was there and always claimed there was no reason for him to be there. We filed a case both about due process and alleging that a lot of people were sent to the Supermax prison in retaliation because they filed lawsuits or they filed grievances. They generally stood up for their rights. The particular man who's up tomorrow is one of the prisoners that we represented individually in that And in fact, the jury ruled that he was sent there in retaliation for filing grievances and lawsuits. So he was wrongfully sent there. And now he's up for parole, ready to go home, we hope. What I wanted to do today, since I'm apparently the first speaker in this, is before we get into some of the particulars about parole, I wanted to really give some background on our prison system in general. And I'm sure some of you already know this, but I just want to I never want to talk about prisons without talking about how many people are in prison. I have some slides, so whoever's in charge of our slides, if we can put the first one up, that would be great. I think that's you, Mike. Second slide. That's just us.
So Alan, whenever you want me to transition.
Yep, go ahead and change the next slide.
Okay, thank you.
So the most important thing about prisons is there are a lot of people in them, and this is a brand new phenomenon. As you can see from the graph here, through most of the history of this country, and it really goes back well before 1920, which is where this graph starts, the prison population was pretty steady. It grew essentially along with the population of the country. And then along came 1970, in the mid-70s, and things started to explode, first in jails and then in prisons. This particular chart just shows the number of people who are in prison. And you can see that between, from the beginning in 1920s all the way through the present, we have 14 times as many prisoners as we have ever had in the history of the country before. It's beginning to drop off a little bit. We'll talk in a minute why some of that drop off has come, but as you can see, even though there's been somewhat of a drop off, there's a long ways to go even to get back to where we were in 1980, let alone get back to where we were in 1920. What people often forget is that in the late 1960s, there was a real movement in this country, not just among the radical left, but among all kinds of people saying that prisons had outlived their usefulness. They didn't work. We had way too many people locked up in them, and we should try something else. And this was not just people on the outside, but the Department of Justice, for example, put out a long white paper saying that we should really rethink this whole idea of locking up so many people. But we didn't obviously change. Instead, we doubled down and tripled down and quadrupled down and whatever the next words are for 6 and 7 times as many people. We exploded the prison population instead of unwinding it. But it's important to remember that even back in 1968, as few people as there were in prison, there were an awful lot of people in this country who said, we just have way too many people in prison. Let's try the next slide. Going beyond prisons, it's important to know where these people are. The vast majority of people who are locked up are in state prisons. Local jails add another chunk. Federal prisons and jails are a much smaller piece. I mean, the federal system is the largest of all of them, but it is collectively much smaller than the state prisons altogether are. And then there's much smaller slices for juvenile, people who are involuntarily committed, Native American, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a number of small slices in there. But over half the people who are locked up in this country are locked up in state prisons. And about a little more than half of the people in the state prisons are there for what are traditionally known as violent crimes. The rest are there for like property crimes, drug crimes, what they call public disorder. But the vast majority of them are there for violent crimes. So if we're really going to do something about shrinking our prison population, you can't just deal with people who have drug offenses. You can't just deal with people who have sort of public disorder sort of offenses. You have to talk about why we have so many people in prison, even for the violent crimes. Murder is a relatively small part of that. It's about, can't do math quickly in my head, but maybe about 1/5 of the violent crimes are murder. The rest are robbery, assault, sexual assault, manslaughter, et cetera. Let's go to the next slide. We always compare ourselves to the rest of the world, particularly Western Europe. And Western Europe has huge variations in how many people that they lock up. Lots of interesting literature going on as to why there's such wide variations. Denmark, for example, has a much more robust social safety net than the UK does. It's also a much more homogenous country than the UK is. So both of those have been one of the theories as to why the UK has such a much higher incarceration rate than many of the other countries in Western Europe. But let's go to the next slide. But when you add the United States in there, the differences in Western Europe just disappear. We're simply in a different world. than everybody else is at least in the Western world. And let's go to the next slide here. One obvious explanation would be, well, the crime rate has been increasing and therefore, of course, we're locking more people up, but that's just not true. You could make an argument that the crime rate was going up at least a little bit from 1970 to 1980. But really since 1980 and certainly since 1990, the crime rate has dropped dramatically, despite what you see in the newspapers. Chicago, for example, has a lower crime rate than it has had for years. The murder rate is down. Robberies are down. And that's true nationally. It's not just Chicago by any means. So this huge growth in prison population really had very little to do with a growth in the crime. So let's go to one more slide and then another one right after that. What I'm going to say is at the beginning of this, we made some choices. And I want to talk about those choices in two different ways. One is we just changed laws. We passed a whole bunch more laws that were sort of tough on crime laws. Many of them are sort of well known. Rockefeller drug laws were really the first thing that came along. Federal mandatory minimums came along. Truth in sentencing came along. In between, Ronald Reagan declared a war on drugs. Various other legal changes that increased the number of people who were in prison. But I think the more interesting question is not what the laws were that were passed, but why were those laws passed? I mean, it's not like some legislators just woke up one day and said, well, let's just pass a whole bunch of laws. There was a real movement, and people forget that even like the crime bill, so much about these days, was backed by the Black Caucus. There was a real demand for increasing incarceration in the early 1970s. And I think a more interesting question is why. So let's go through a couple of events that happened at that time. Next slide. Democratic Convention in Chicago. What we now think of as a riot happened. Lots and lots of tear gassing and people running around the streets. Lots and lots of broken bones. It's when Mayor Daley famously ordered that the police should shoot to kill anybody who's looting. Let's go to the next one. Kent State, about also in 1970. Its first one was 68, now in 1970, where the National Guard killed students who were protesting against the war. Next slide. Very similar thing happened a couple of weeks later in Jackson State, a historically black college in Mississippi, where they were also protesting against the war. And again, 3 protesters, all black, were killed by the National Guard there. On the right, you can see a dormitory building that was shot up. These are all bullet holes that were shot up in the dormitory building. Next slide. Most famously, it probably was the Attica Uprising. Again, a couple of years later, where prisoners at Attica took over a portion of the prison for several days before the National Guard and other sort of quasi-military forces took it back. Let's go to the next slide real quickly here. A Wounded Knee is another one that happened at about the same time, also in the 1970s, where Native Americans took over the town of Wounded Knee, ultimately ousted by the FBI. So, and let's go to one more slide, which sort of puts that all together. There's sort of 2 ways all those events could be viewed. On the one hand, you can say, well, we've got police that are out of control. So we now know the Chicago riots were really a police riot. They really just decided they weren't going to put up with peaceful protesters. Same thing at Kent State. We know that all of the shots that were fired by the National Guard at student protesters. We now know the same thing about Attica. Even though at the beginning, as they took it over, the press was told that the reason they had to use such violence to take it over is because the prisoners were holding the guards hostages. They had slit their throats. They had actually allegedly emasculated some of them. What we know now is that none of that was true at all. All of the injuries that were suffered, whether it be by prisoners or on guards, were in fact inflicted in the takeover of the prison by the National Guard, guards, et cetera, that took it back over. None were injured during the actual takeover of the prison. Wounded Knee the same way, although clearly the Native Americans were armed. The vast majority of people who were killed at Wounded Knee were killed by the FBI, not by the Native American activists. So one lesson from all this could have been, hey, we've got police that are out of control. We need to really rein this in, and we have to rethink our whole system of criminal activity and how we respond to it. But there was a whole other narrative. And that other narrative depended on race, depended on other people, and the narrative, and let's go to the next slide here. And this was a narrative that was politically driven. This particular one comes from Attica, where Nixon did us the favor of, taping all of his conversations. Nixon stayed very much in touch with Rockefeller during the entire Attica uprising. And as you can see here, Nixon says, well, this is the black people, right? And Rockefeller says, yeah, the whole thing was led by blacks. And then Nixon essentially says, well, you're not going to have a problem. So the other counter narrative here, and it was very much an intentional narrative that was developed around Attica, but also around many of these other events, is that folks in prison aren't like the rest of us. They're animals. The only way to control them is with huge amounts of violence. These protesters, they're not actually regular people. They're not like you and me. They're somebody different. They somehow are wired differently. And therefore, the violence we use against them is the only way we can deal with it. And that's the narrative that has won out. And we see that in the way prisons operate today. There's a lot of othering going on. I've always said, if you're a guard and your job is to keep somebody in a cage, you can't do that job if you think the person in the cage as your daughter or your son. You can only do that if you pretend that somehow they're different than the people you hang out with outside of prison. Because otherwise, I think it leads to a total disconnect. Why am I keeping this person in a cage? Why is this my job? Can we really treat them as horribly as we treat them? Can I actually use force against them? All the kinds of things that go on in prison, really can't do. Next slide. There's one myth I do want to address here. There's a lot of people that talk about how private prisons are the drivers of the mass incarceration and how for-profit is the whole problem. Well, as you can see from this slide, it's just not true. Private prisons are a very small part of the overall incarceration. They're much more like a parasite on the system. What's a parasite? It's something that sort of delves into the system and gets its nutrients from the system, but isn't running the system at all. It's just living off of the system. And that's what private prisons really are here. We have this mass incarceration going on, and some small number of private operators have figured out how to make a profit out of that. And that becomes really clear when you follow the money. Let's go to the next slide. So the vast majority of money we spend on corrections, jail, probation, parole, etc., go to public employees. We're talking about guards. We're talking about parole agents. That's where most of that money goes. You have to go way down this chart. And if you look at the next slide, I had to split it in 2 slides because it's so far down the road. Private prison profits are way down at the bottom. Only 37 cents, 0.37 of this total that we talked about for guards. It's a tiny portion. So it's not private prisons that are driving this. The whole 182 billion, it's only 0.37 billion, less than 1 billion, a third of 1 billion that go to this private prisons in terms of profits. So they're not the drivers of this system. Let's go one more. You do have to talk about race, however. Race is very much a driver of this system. 2 little things. So the red lines here are the risk of imprisonment by young black men, and the blue lines are for white men. And among high school dropouts, the first and I think in some ways scariest thing about this chart is that over half of the high school dropouts that are young black men are going to end up incarcerated at some point in their life before the age of 35. That's a huge percentage. We simply lock up more than half of this group of people. The other thing that I think is really a little bit surprising, and to me anyway, horrifying about these numbers, is that the gap between black and white is about 5 to 1. And it's about 5 to 1 whether or not you're a high school dropout or whether you're a college graduate. So, I mean, you're much less likely to go to prison if you're a college graduate. So don't get me wrong, college, obviously, the more education you have, it's better for you. You're much less likely to go to prison. But even among college graduates, it's about a 5 to 1 ratio of blacks to white that go to prison. So this misalignment of race and the number of people who are in prison makes it much easier, given the embedded racism in this country, much easier to other people in prison. Because you can say, well, so many of them are young black men. They're not like us, the middle-class white people, whoever the us may be. And it isn't just white people, by the way. As I said, originally, it was a number of black residents also wanted this mass incarceration stuff. Let's go to the next slide. And you can see just how this difference in rate has led to the growth of the prison system. So the sort of dotted line on the bottom here is the white rate of incarceration. And yes, it too has risen dramatically since starting in the mid-70s. But the X's on the top, that's the black rate of incarceration. And that's the one that has exploded since 1976. So this experiment in mass incarceration that we've been engaged in the last 50 years is very much an experiment on young Black men, not on the population as a whole. Let's go to the next slide. Drug possession, however, is one of the drivers of this. Now, they're not by any means a majority of people in prison, as I said at the very beginning, but we arrest lots and lots and lots of people for simple possession of drugs. And most of those drug arrests are for simple possession. You can see the dark orange lines at the top. That's the possession ones. The yellow ones at the bottom, that's the sale manufacture of drugs. So that's the sort of dealers are on the bottom and just the people with possession are on the top. And again, these are arrests. These are not convictions. These are what the arrests are. So even though many of the possession ones may, in the end, may have been started off as sales and got bargained down, this is what they were charged with initially. So again, the war on drugs, which has been one of the drivers of this, has been very much against people who possess drugs, not the big sellers, distributors, et cetera. Let's go to the next slide. So again, it is 1 in 5 people who are incarcerated for a drug offense. That is true whether you're talking about youth, federal, local, state, et cetera. Those are a fifth, which is a substantial percentage, but not by any means the majority. So as one of the criminologists who studies this says, we could let out every single person who's currently in prison and jail for a drug-related offense, and the United States would still have the highest incarceration rate in the entire world. So yes, drugs are a big problem. The war on drugs is a driver of mass incarceration, but it is not the sole driver, and it would not solve the problem if you let all those people out. Let's go to the next slide. And even among drug use, it's not who uses, it's where we look for those use. So the dark blue lines are who uses drugs, and it's about the same throughout the population, including both income and race. So about 70%, 75% of the drug users are white because they're about 75% of the population. About 12 to 15% of the drug users are Black, and the same for Latino, because again, those are roughly the percentages in the population. But when you look at the light blue lines, which is who is incarcerated for drug crimes, and you see just the opposite. That even though white people account for 75% of users, they only account for about 1/3 of the people that are locked up for drugs. And among Black people, it's exactly the reverse. Even though they're only about 12% of the users, they constitute about 45% of the people who are locked up for using drugs. So the lesson here is that a lot of what we think of as crime and leading to incarceration has everything to do with where we look for crime, where the police patrol. There's a book called Dorm Room Dealers, which compares a Southern California university with a nearby public housing development as terms of drug use, and they found that drug use is far more rampant on the college campuses than it is in the public housing development. But that, of course, is not where we develop our police resources. If we flooded our colleges with the same sort of constant police presence, undercover drug buys, flipping people, threatening them with long sentences in order to get them to flip on somebody else on college campuses, as we do on the poor Black section of town, then our prisons would be full of middle-class white people. And if our prisons had 90% middle-class white people, I don't think the public would put up with it, because then it becomes much harder to other those folks. So what does all this mean for litigation? Let's go to the next slide for a minute. So while the prison population has increased, for a while, the number of civil rights cases, and we're talking here about federal civil rights cases brought by prisoners, also increased dramatically, beginning in 1970 and going through really 1980, the early 1980s, it just skyrocketed. That was a period of time when the federal courts first decided that they actually had something to say about what happened in prison. through the 60s, they really didn't. They were hands off. Then it dropped down a little bit after that initial surge. And then came the Prison Litigation Reform Act under Bill Clinton. And that did several things that made it much harder to get your cases in court. And it has had exactly the impact that they wanted it to have, which was to cut down the ability of prisoners to bring their cases to court. So ever since the mid-1990s, the number of prisoners who have been able to get a case into court has dropped dramatically, and has continued to drop, and is nowhere near the amount of litigation that used to be happening back in the 1970s and 1980s. Part of that had to do with the Prison Litigation Reform Act. Other things that have made it harder and harder to bring cases to prison, for example, in the federal prisons, the Supreme Court has dramatically narrowed what used to be called the Bivens cases. That is your ability to sue directly prison officials saying that they violated the Constitution and you get damages. The Supreme Court has narrowed those claims almost to non-existence. And I suspect the next time they get one, they will simply overrule Bivens. Yes, thank you, Mike. The AEDPA, which I can never remember what it stands for, but it's the Death Penalty and Terrorist Act, makes it even harder to bring habeas corpus cases, much harder to bring habeas corpus cases. Again, the chart up here is about civil rights cases, but habeas corpus cases have also gone down dramatically. There have been limitations put on the FTCA cases, the Federal Tort Claim Act, which is another way federal prisoners can bring claims against individual guards. And then we have some really bad case law from courts. For example, in order to show if you were beaten up in prison by a guard, it's not enough that you're beaten up for no good reason. You now have to show that the guard was acting maliciously and sadistically. So it's all about what the subjective intent of the guard was rather than what actually happened to the prisoner. And then, of course, there's just jury hostility. Much like we've seen over the years, that there has been some hostility to personal injury cases. The insurance industry has made a very good effort at trying to convince people that people who bring tort cases are usually faking it or otherwise aren't entitled to money. The same sort of thing has been happening with prisons. You hear a lot about so-called frivolous prisoner cases. I can tell you from the 70 to 100 letters we get per week, I would say in my career of reading those letters over the last 25 years, they're not more than a dozen or so that are just totally frivolous cases. Doesn't mean they would all be winners. There may be all kinds of reasons you can't bring a case, but it's not because people are complaining about something that really didn't have any real effect on them. And one of the prime examples, just to give you one horror story that's often used by people who are saying prisoners are way too litigious. There's a famous case where the way it was portrayed in Congress was that somebody filed a lawsuit complaining they got creamy peanut butter instead of chunky peanut butter. Well, when you dig into that, what you see, what really happened in that case is the prisoner orders from commissary chunky peanut butter. He gets creamy peanut butter. He sends it back saying, hey, you sent the wrong one. Can you send me the right one? Then he's transferred from prison A to prison B. And prison B, they say, I don't know what you're talking about. There's no evidence of any commissary slips here whatsoever. You don't get anything. So basically they stole his money and they didn't refund it. So basically they stole his money. Yes, it was only a jar of peanut butter, but if you're in prison and you only get $10 a month and peanut butter is overpriced, so you probably paid $5 for your peanut butter, they took half of your income for the month. Most of us would sue if somebody stole half of our income for a month. So yes, in some ways it's frivolous in the sense that, yeah, it's about a jar of peanut butter. But when you look at it from a prisoner's perspective, it's not frivolous at all, because it's all about it's all about their rights and they shouldn't steal money from prisoners. No question about it. Somebody ought to be able to do something about it. The federal courts are the option we have. I want to sort of conclude my little introduction thing here by saying we don't have to run prison systems like we do. And I just want to compare and contrast two different cells here. So if you can go to the very next slide. This is a cell at Pontiac Correctional Center, one of the Illinois maximum security prisons. This is actually a single cell. Virtually all of them have been double celled. And so when they double cell them, they don't make the bigger cells. They just put a second bed on top of this bed you got here. it's barren, it's terrible, it looks bad. If you look at the toilet sink combination, you see there's not even a cover on the toilet. So every time you flush the toilet, it means that fecal matter goes out into the cell, onto the bed, onto the sink where you're drinking the water out of. This is not a pleasant place to live. Next slide. This is a maximum security prison cell in Norway. Why does it look so different? Because they have a very different philosophy of what corrections is all about. In the United States, as I said, we sort of other people, we say, hey, the only way we can control these animals is by partially punishing them. Norway has an entirely different philosophy. It's not just Norway, most of the Scandinavian countries, Germany has adopted the same sort of philosophy. Say the reason that people violate the law is because they have been disconnected from the social systems that they should be part of. That most of us follow the law, not because we're afraid of being punished, but because we are part of a social fabric and understand that if we all follow the basic rules, we'll all be better off. And so the Scandinavian or Norwegian version of that is if you have become disconnected from that social fabric, so you're no longer part of that community, then that's when you commit crimes. Therefore, the purpose of prison has to be to rebuild those social networks. And that means you can't isolate people in horrible little cells. You have to make your prisons, first of all, they're located in communities. So a 200-bed prison in a city would be common in Norway, whereas Pontiac, which I just showed you, is a 2,000-bed facility, 3 hours, about 200 miles from Chicago. And Menard is even further down in Southern Illinois. It's 6 hours from Chicago on a good day. And they don't like have the serving lines like you often have in prison. Each of these cells are part of a little group of cells, and there's a kitchen. The prisoners get together, they come up with a grocery list, they give it to a guard. The guard has to go out and buy the groceries, and then the prisoners do the cooking for themselves. If they don't cooperate, they don't eat. So the whole point is to build systems of cooperation again. The guards hang out and watch football with them. They wear ordinary clothes. Most prisoners in Norway go home for the weekends. Most prisoners in Norway have a job, not a job like the stereotypical making license plates, but a job in the community. So it's a very different philosophy. And the idea is after your year or so, and 5 years is a very long sentence in Norway, then you're ready to go back into community. You have those community ties again, and you can go home. So, you know, it's a very different philosophy. Norway's prisons used to look a lot like ours and used to have the same philosophy of ours. And then back in the 1980s, instead of doubling down and having this huge increase, they said, you know, this isn't working. Let's try something else. And they did, and it's working better than ours. They have a lower recidivism rate than we do, a lower crime rate than we do. Clearly, you don't need to lock people up in horrible little cells for decades in order to have a safe community. And the interesting thing is there's now being done some good criminological work suggesting that, in fact, mass incarceration is making us less safe because we have locked up so many people. And again, it's not spread throughout the community. It's in very select communities. That those communities where we lock up people, a lot of people up from are also the communities that have a high crime rate. And therefore, we have broken down the existing social bonds in those communities by pulling so many people out of those communities and sending them to prison. And therefore, there's just not an opportunity for those bonds to form anymore in those communities. And it's the breakdown of the social order in those communities that actually is leading to a lot of the criminal behavior that we see. You know, our mayor has tried to sort of suggest that. He's gotten a huge amounts of pushback whenever he mentions it. But he says, you know, why do young people from the south and west sides of Chicago, which is the poor Black communities if you're not from Chicago, why do they end up downtown? Well, it's because we've disinvested from their communities and there's nothing for them to do. So they go downtown. And then they scare people because there are big groups of young Black people downtown. And they all think it's the end of the world. So that's sort of the background of where we're at. And you know what I really want to say here is that talking about litigation, you know, anybody spending time in prison knows that your rights are violated every day. There are so many problems in prison, whether it's from not getting decent medical care, whether it's use of force, whether it's being celled with somebody who's dangerous to you, whether it's not being able to go to law library, whether it's getting a false disciplinary report. Every day you could
violating your civil rights with religion.
Absolutely. Yes. Good point. I don't know who that was, but whoever said, violation of your rights to practice your own religion in a variety of different ways, all kinds of different ways that's done. Censorship of mail, censorship of books. I was talking about Attica earlier. One of the cases we brought was Heather Thompson, who wrote that book, sued because Illinois had censored her book. They wouldn't allow the book in the prison system. So we had to sue in order to get the book in the prison system. We settled that case, and the book was allowed to go in. And in fact, now there's a copy in every prison law library, or every prison library in every prison in Illinois. So, but why do we have to go to court for that? There's no reason in the world that book should have just been let in. And in fact, the way they defended it was interesting. They said any book that makes correctional officers look bad is a danger to safety and security. And that is just absurd. That is not supposed to be the standard. That's what the First Amendment is all about, is you're supposed to be able to criticize the government and its employees. Yet prison systems are, again, they're closed societies and they want to do things. So my point here is, even when you're in prison, you have to choose your battles. You can't litigate about everything. You can't file grievances about everything. And I would say once you're out, one of the questions that I get a lot when I do these presentations is, well, is it worth continuing a fight that I started when I was in prison? And the answer, of course, is typical lawyer answer. It depends. Sorry, I can't be more direct than that. Some cases, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I was doing today was sitting in on a trial being done by a friend of mine for a woman who was raped in prison, and she's now out. So is she continuing that? Absolutely, she's going to continue that. It's a principle, and she suffered horribly. She continues to suffer the ill effects of that. So yeah, she should absolutely bring that. On the other hand, if your complaint is about, you got a grievance report that you weren't supposed to, they took away some of your good time that they shouldn't get it, and now you're out of prison. Do you really want to devote the rest of your life to fighting battles that are sort of over with? Maybe not. So, I think that just like we have to choose our battles in prison, we have to do the same thing after people are released. I'm done with the slides. If you want to stop sharing a screen, you can do that. So, in prison, the vast majority of problems are actually not solved through sort of litigation and other sort of confrontational ways. Most of them are worked out informally, informal channels, whether it be talking to a guard, trying to figure out what you can do, what you can't do, whether it be working around the system. The same thing is true on parole. I've always said people who are on parole officers have huge amounts of discretion. They can violate you for all kinds of different things. And therefore, just like when you're in prison, it's really important that we choose our battles when you're out on the street on parole. Again, people get their rights violated all the time. Somebody put in here diesel therapy as the name of what happens when they transfer people around prisons in order to keep you off balance and so you're not connected to people. The sort of flip side of that is when you're out on parole, often people have to lose their housing. And then you can get violated because you don't have a place to live. On the other hand, the parole officer could not violate you, but instead help you find a place to live. So I think that often trying to work these things out informally with people on parole works just as well as it does when you're inside prison. But again, I always say litigation is often the worst solution except for all the others. So sometimes there's no choice. In other words, sometimes litigating is all that there can do, and that's what we're here for. Criminal case. So I could guess, but I would only be guessing because I've never done a criminal case and I don't want to guess. I do want to say one thing that Mike just said, and sort of tooting my own horn here. I talked very briefly about a woman who was raped, whose trial I was observing earlier today. I teach at Northwestern as an adjunct at the law school, of course, about prisoners and prison rights. The two lawyers who are doing that were both my former students. So they went on and not only took my class, but are now representing some prisoners in some really horrific cases. So that is one of the reasons I do classes like this, and this is why I teach at Northwestern, is to get those young lawyers and get people in general this information and try to make them understand what's going on. And my hope is at least a number of those students, as I said earlier, the more you know about the system, the less you can live with it without trying to do something about it. And these two young lawyers absolutely have taken it on. They're doing a bang up job for this woman, trying to get her some justice. So I fully agree with Mike that our job is to spread the word and bring in more recruits.
Any final comments or any final questions for Alan?
Okay.
Thank you
well,
so much. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Alan. Thank you so much, Michael. Alan, it was a pleasure as always and an honor to have you speak again. And I can see that by our attendance that remained throughout the last hour and a half, there was great interest in your presentation. That's for sure.
Well, you always bring a good group of people together with a good discussion. So thank you for inviting me again.
And for
Thank
everyone attending this evening, we're going to have 3 consecutive sessions remaining the following 3 Wednesdays. So we look forward to your participation. I see Mark, you're with us. Mark Weinberg will be one of our speakers, as I think you've seen all of you in the course agenda that you've received. Then we have Elizabeth Kelly, who's a very tremendous speaker as well. And then I'll be speaking with a couple of individuals from Alan's office, the final session. So we look forward very much to that. And Alan, we'd be honored to have you here again next year, of course. So thank
Let
you
me
so
know.
much.
Right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
all. Thank you all so much for staying with us. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Okay, well, it's just all hinted people and Gary. Hey, guys. I thought that went very well. If you're here, what do you guys think?